Okay, so we are now back in open session at 7:14 PM. So this is, we're going to make have some votes related to transfer appeals. So do we have a motion on agenda item 6.1, the transfer appeal on behalf of EDB?
Yes, I move to affirm the decision of the superintendent and deny the relief requested.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion? Okay, having a motion by Secretary Boswell and a second by Trustee Zapata, we will now vote. All those in favor, raise your right hand. The motion passes unanimously. 6.2, do I have a motion on agenda item 6.2, the transfer appeal on behalf of ED?
Yes, I move to affirm the decision of the superintendent and deny the relief requested.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, is there any discussion? All right, having a motion by Secretary Boswell and a second by Trustee Zapata to deny the appeal, we will now vote. All those in favor, raise your right hand. The motion passes unanimously. Do I have a motion on agenda item 6.3, the transition appeal on behalf of JP?
Yes, I move to affirm the decision of the superintendent and deny the relief requested.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
All right, is there any discussion? All right, having a motion by Secretary Boswell and a second by Trustee Zapata. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Great, the motion passes unanimously. Do I have a motion on agenda item 6.4, the transfer appeal on behalf of MDS?
Yes, I move to affirm the decision of the superintendent and deny the relief requested.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Okay, having a motion by Secretary Boswell and a second by Trustee Zapata. All those in favor, raise your right hand. All right, the motion passes unanimously. Do I have a motion on agenda item 6.5, the transfer appeal on behalf of CR?
Yes, I move to affirm the decision of the superintendent and deny the relief requested.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, any discussion? All right, having a motion by Secretary Boswell and a second by Trustee Zapata. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. The motion passes unanimously. Do I have a motion on agenda item 6.6, the transfer appeal on behalf of HP?
Yes, I move to affirm the decision of the superintendent and deny the relief requested.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All right, having a motion by Secretary Boswell and a second by Trustee Zapata. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Motion passes unanimously. Next, do I have a motion on agenda item 6.7, the transfer appeal on behalf of SW?
Yes, I move to affirm the decision of the superintendent and deny the relief requested.
All right, is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All right, having a motion by Secretary Boswell and a second by Trustee Zapata. All those in favor, raise your right hand. The motion passes unanimously. The last one, do I have a motion on agenda item 6.8, the transfer appeal on behalf of NC?
Yes, I move to affirm the decision of the superintendent and deny the relief requested.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All right, having a motion by Secretary Boswell and a second by Trustee Zapata. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, board members. Really appreciate that. So now we will move to our public comment. But before we proceed, we will allow the team to begin broadcasting live. Are they already broadcasting live? Okay. All right, so thank you. So we're now broadcasting live for our viewers watching from home. Our previous items were conducted in closed session, so broadcast, okay. So next is an opportunity for the public to share comments with the board. So members of the public who wanted to participate in public comment called a dedicated AISD phone line in advance of the meeting to audio record their remarks or to sign up to speak in person. So tonight we have one person who signed up to speak in person. We have two who left recorded messages. So we will now move to the in-person testimony. And come to the microphone. There's a device that will light up as you move through your 1 minute of allotted time. When the buzzer sounds, please make a final thought in one sentence. So we will start. We will have our in-person speaker tonight, Ken Zarefis, whenever you're ready.
Good evening, Board Superintendent. My name is Ken Zarefis. I'm President of Education Austin, the Employees Union for AISD. I want to thank this board and the superintendent and his administration for the thoughtfulness and the thoroughness of this Vader process. It hasn't been easy, we realize that. We know there are challenges of increased taxes and where those dollars may go. But we're equally aware and more deeply concerned about what will happen without additional funding. I would much rather face a community member that has to pay a few more dollars than to face a bus driver or a teaching assistant or a custodian or a food service worker or a teacher that lost their job because we as a community didn't do the appropriate things to make sure that funding our schools was adequate to keep these people in their jobs. We are a community, and as such, and as a community, we have a responsibility to see that our children are taken care of. And the first way we can do that publicly and collectively is through our public schools. This is the only opportunity we have as a community to fund our schools. We must do it. Thank you for supporting it, and I hope that our community gets out and votes yes for this Vader. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So we will now play the recorded messages for public comment, so please listen carefully.
Hi, my name is Marie, parent of multiple children in AISD. I want to thank the real estate department and its leader for their difficult and diligent efforts, as well as for choosing a great partner for the Coy site. Kudos to administration and trustees for sound decisions during a difficult time. I also separately want to remind the board and administration that our transfer policies and practices are at issue specifically related to students with disabilities. Please review and amend accordingly to protect the rights and civil rights of this population. Thank you.
My name is Ben Sotheby. I'm a resident in District 1, uncle of a McBee Elementary student, and proud to be a union member here in our community. I'm calling regarding the voter approval tax rate election. I was very glad to see that the budget this year included that. I think that there's great work being done at AISD, not just the teachers, but also support staff. Everyone there is doing a great job. Strongly support all the work done by Education Austin as well. The tax rate that's proposed is very reasonable. It's an average of the rates between 2022 and 2023 per $100 valuation. And sadly, we live in a time when public education is under attack, especially here in Texas. I know I will support it. I'll knock doors and get all my neighborhood, my friends to vote for it as well. The people do hard work and they need a raise, not just a one-time bump, but something that's ongoing. Please do pass this. Please do support this. Our community needs to fund education.
Okay, so this concludes public comment. Trustees, are there any questions or clarifications? Okay, thank you. So as a reminder to the public, please feel free to share any general comments or questions with the board by email at trustees@austinisd.org. So tonight, the board is scheduled to discuss a potential tax rate election and upcoming budget work. We're not going to vote on anything tonight. But this is really a chance for our community to follow along where we are in the process. So prior to this public discussion, the board will briefly move into executive session in order to obtain legal counsel regarding a potential tax rate election. So we will now recess the open meeting at 7:23 p.m. and move to executive session pursuant to Texas Government Code sections 551.074, 551.072, 551.073, 551.087, 551.076, 551.0821, and 551.071. Thank you so much. We'll be back. we will now reconvene the open meeting at 8:03 PM. The board is scheduled to discuss a potential voter approval tax rate election, or VATER. The board started this discussion in May, and as a part of the budget we currently approved in June, the district has assumed additional revenue that would require a higher tax rate than currently approved. So tonight's discussion is an opportunity to hear from the administration on a process and timeline for a VATER and what this would mean for our community. So Superintendent Segura, can you present our items?
Absolutely. Thank you, President Singh. Tonight, as you just mentioned, we'll be discussing the potential Austin ISD VATER. I'd like to invite Dr. Jacob Reach, Chief Officer, Government Relations and Board Services, along with Ed Ramos, our Chief Financial Officer, to provide the update. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions the trustees may have.
Thank you. Good evening, President Singh, Board of Trustees. So tonight we want to walk through a voter approval tax rate election overview and timeline. And so we're going to refer to that as VATER. So looking at our timeline, there are some legal requirements that we have to ensure that we accomplish as part of a VATER election. We actually started that back in May when the board approved an efficiency study with Moak Casey. And then, of course, the budget was approved on June 20th. As part of that budget, it actually assumed revenue that would require a higher tax rate, which is kind of that first step towards working towards a VATER. Closely aligned and just tied at the hip with it is also we've started some of our realignment and long-term budget process. So that really kicked off earlier this week, and our next presentation will go over that one in a little bit more depth. We also had a deadline for TCAD to provide certified appraisal rules. The deadline was the 25th, but we actually received those today. That was officially sent to our board president and shared with our financial team. So that one is checked off. And our next big deadline is for TEA to provide our maximum compressed rate. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. As part of this budget work that we're looking at, that again is closely aligned to this, we do want to bring together a joint advisory committee. And so those conversations we're hoping to start around August 6th. I'm sorry. This is really about bringing information out on our VATER election. So these are community conversations on the VATER election. And we are looking at those potentially August 6th. And then 2 on August 7th, and we'll be offering those in English and Spanish. And then August 8th, right now, potentially calling for a VATER. And if needed, we also want to hold August 15th as that backup. And we will make sure that we have more information to our public soon on when they could potentially expect a vote if that moves forward. Just to let you know, August 20th is our start of school. We'll continue those joint advisory conversations. And we're hoping to end that work somewhere around September 20th. And at the September 26th board meeting will be potentially the first opportunity for the board to hear that efficiency audit and receive that hearing, which is another legal requirement of the VATER election. And then, of course, November 5th would be the election day. So I want to give a little bit of what is a VATER and what makes up this tax rate in recapture. So the voter approved tax rate election, it's required by the state to where we have to ask voters to approve the tax rate to increase revenue for our student programs, for teachers and staff salaries, and for overall operational expenses. The reason that we need a VATER is because of what the state calls a Tier 2 tax rate. So you have your Tier 1 tax rate, and that's the maximum a district can levy without voter approval. Prior to HB3, that was set at $1. Since then, there's been compression, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that Tier 2 rate is really where you need voter approval. So Board of Trustees actually have some leeway for approving the first few golden pennies for a district. But anything after those first, and I believe it's 4, is that correct, Ed? Yeah, after those first 4 require voter approval for the next 4 golden and then all those copper pennies. Austin ISD is currently at 0.079, so 7.9 cents of golden pennies. And I hear often, why are we at 7.9? Why are we not just at the maximum 8? And it actually goes back to when we approved this, the rates were different. And we actually previously had some golden and some copper. So that extra 2.9 was actually part of our copper rate. They then added golden pennies, which is why we're slightly off. So the tax rate would be looking at increasing that last 0.1 of the golden pennies and then increasing our copper pennies. So want to show how that breaks down a little bit. What you see here is the M&O breakdown, and that's at tier 1. And right now we are looking at 65.75 cents for every $100 evaluation. That first tier 1 is subject to recapture. And it is also part of what the state calls a maximum compressed rate. So that rate actually goes down, and I'm going to touch on that in a minute as well. Then that tier 2 golden, you can have up to 8 cents. And then that tier 2 copper, you can have up to 9 cents. So to kind of give a brief overview of these tier systems in the M&O system, the Texas school finance system that we know today actually dates back to 1984. The biggest change that happened was 1995, and that's with a lot of the same rules that we see now. Some of these recapture rules, some of this maintenance and operation rules. And then there's been various fixes since that time, with the most recent being in 2019, and that's the last time that we've seen any significant increase to funding in public education. So that first part, tier 1, is what guarantees that equitable level of funding. Now, I'm not saying that it's adequate, but the system does look at how it is equitably providing funding for school districts across Texas based off of student population. So tier 1 is made up of various program allotments in different weights based off of based off of the needs of a student. And then a district raises their revenue through their local taxes, and that's called the local share. If what a district raises is less than what this tier 1 guarantee says that they are guaranteed or entitled to, then the state makes up that difference. If a district's share is greater than that entitlement, then that additional portion is recaptured back to the state. And the state actually offers different mechanisms on how to do this, but in effect, Austin ISD sends that additional revenue to the state, which then lowers the state's obligations of what they need to provide out of the general fund towards education. And so then the state can then have other more general funds for different purposes. The tier 1 formulas are providing the same amount of funding to each district based on that student need and student enrollment in various programs, such as special education, CTE, dyslexia services. Higher recapture payments do not change the amount that's provided to other school districts. It does not change the amount that's provided to Austin ISD, or provide more money to education overall. So the next part is tier 2, and that's considered enrichment funding. So tier 2 is above the basic entitlement that all districts receive. The golden pennies are not subject to recapture. As I mentioned originally, the state allowed 6, now it's 8. The state does provide a guaranteed yield for a golden penny, or the amount of money that anyone should make on 1 cent of tax effort out of that yield. For Austin ISD, we're above that yield, so that doesn't necessarily apply to us. And we do keep what's raised out of it because those golden pennies are not subject to recap. The next part, the tier 2, is our copper pennies. Originally, districts could ask up to 11 copper pennies. With 2 of those changing to golden pennies, there's now 9 copper pennies that can be gained by a district. The state also guarantees a certain amount of revenue for those pennies. If a district is below it, the state makes up a difference. If the district is above it, such as Austin ISD, then the state will recapture what's above that amount. There is a little bit of nuance to all of this, but that's kind of a simplified version of how those tiers work for school finance. The last part that I want to mention is that maximum compressed rate, or MCR. And the state uses local taxable property value growth throughout the foundation school program, and then multiplies it by the tax rate to determine what is going to be that maximum compressed rate. But I think the basic way to explain it is from a homeowner's point of view. So the idea behind that MCR was that the state would lower the district's portion of a tax rate for a homeowner so that even if there is property growth, they would not see an increase in that portion of their property growth or their property bill for taxes. So that's the theory behind it. Because growth is different across the state and values are different across the state, it doesn't always work out that way. It is possible that a homeowner could still see that portion of their tax rate grow because growth is so high. But that's the idea behind it. And then the state on the back end ensures that a school district still receives what they would have been entitled to off of that original rate. So on the flip side, the district does not lose anything. So in other words, it increases the state's share of funding by subsidizing for taxpayers. As I mentioned, sometimes it grows so much that that the taxes are still going up. And so when people say, oh, well, my taxes still went up, that is possible. And also, because it does not occur to those tier 2 pennies, it does not occur to city taxes, it does not occur to all those other taxes that are on there. We are one portion of it, that this just simply limits how much the tax bill could grow for an individual homeowner. So before I move on to talk a little bit more about our tax rate, I do want to touch on our legislative priorities, because Austin ISD in this board just last month adopted priorities closely associated to what I just went over. On the funding side, Austin ISD is prioritizing increasing the basic allotment, which we know is the #1 way that all schools can benefit across the board in an equal manner. We are actually, Trustee Singh, Superintendent Segura and I were at a meeting earlier and someone asked a great question. How much would the basic allotment need to grow to cover what our current deficit is? And so I want to highlight that because I want to bring that up when we talk about the deficit. I did the math to figure it out. So we also want to adjust the basic allotment based off of inflation. So not only does there need to be a sizable increase in the basic allotment, it needs to keep up with inflation year after year. We also want to update the foundation school program to align with the actual cost of programs. Many of these rates were set, any of those times from 1995 onward, and they may not be updated to what the current rate of those programs are. And then, of course, we want to increase funding for special education. On our legislative priorities for recapture, we do want to ensure that a recapture formula reflects the student population. So it needs to understand the eco-DIS population and the other student demographic populations when calculating a district's recapture. We also are supportive of an early payment discount. And then one of my absolute favorites, requiring that all recapture dollars be spent on education on top of the existing foundation school program. So I mentioned already that right now that frees up the state's general fund to then be used elsewhere. This priority would really say that anything that comes into recapture has to be spent on top of what is already entitled for districts. You can learn more about all of our legislative priorities and our legislative work at austinisd.org/legislator. So I want to look briefly at our tax rate history. And this is where you can see how compression has really started playing a role in that decrease of the M&O portion. So this chart right here shows our INS and our M&O. The M&O is the blue portion. From 17 and 18, it was $1.07.9. Starting in that 1920 year, following HB3, that rate started decreasing. For the school year that just ended, we were looking at 73 cents on our M&O, and then our 12.3 cents, which was an increase of 1 cent after our successful bond election on our INS. And then the last column shows what the proposed rate would be if a Vader would to be approved. I do want to stress, and I'll talk about this on the next slide as well, this is before we have our final MCR value, so it is possible that that could change. But this is our estimated rates. So the chart that you see up here is looking at Austin ISD and our surrounding districts and showing all of our neighboring districts who have already requested part of their Tier 2 gold or Tier 2 copper pennies. Those that are in red are at the maximum amount. And then you also have your INS rate. So from Austin, or following Austin, these are in numerical order of highest to lowest. If Austin was in there, we would actually be at the bottom at the moment. And so that is what our current tier 1 is, and then accessing the 7.9. If we were to have a Vader, we would move up 2, so there'd be 2 schools lower than us. But ours would increase, and again, thinking somewhere around 0.9505 with those increased tier 2 copper pennies. So also want to look at what that means for other urban or similar size, similar positioned suburban districts in the state. So this is showing all those urbans. You can see a lot more of our urban counterparts have maximized that tier 2. Many of them have maximized the copper, or started going into the copper pennies. Again, these are in order. At the moment, Austin ISD would be right there at the bottom of all of these. And with a Vader election, we'd be second from the bottom. We would just jump over Houston ISD. So I want to talk about what a Vader would mean for a homeowner. This is a chart that Mr. Ramos had shared with the board back in June. But just to remind you, right now, there's the homestead exemption of $100,000 and a 10% taxable assessed value cap. So growth is, even if the house grows more than 10%, the growth that you're taxed on is capped at that 10%. So trying to understand that if a Vader were in place, what would that mean for a homeowner? And looking at an average home in Austin at $553,000 with that exemption, AISD taxes without a Vader would be about $3,897. With would be $4,310. That's an increase of about $34 per month to a homeowner if a Vader were to pass. So again, just want to break down our budget summary before we get into our how the Vader expenditures would add into this. So the first column that you see is our general fund without a Vader. Second is with a Vader. And so looking at our total revenue, obviously revenue would go up if a Vader were to pass. Recapture would also go up because, as I mentioned earlier, those new copper pennies would be subject to recapture. Our operating expenditures obviously similar under both plans. So then you can see what that would be for a net change in our fund balance. Starting at a 119 without a Vader, or 78 with a Vader. A Vader does have some additional investment, which I'll talk about in a minute. So with trying to understand what we know we can start cutting, looking at a net change in those values at either 56 million or 41 million. And then trying to understand what would be our ending total fund balance with that, and where are we at with our requirement of above 20%. So now I want to break down those Vader expenditures for us. Again, we would request 9.1 cent. That would bring in about $171 million new to our revenue. Out of that, we would have about 17.5 million put aside for our compensation plan. And we would also want to make some investments in staffing that support our campuses. That includes instructional coaches, content interventionists, special education, and mental health supports. And we would be looking at doing about 3.5 million on that. The remainder is about 20 million, or there'd be another 20 million, which would be that remainder that we would want to use as deficit reduction. So that 20 million would go to our overall deficit and reduce it from where we're at. The rest of it would, as I said, increase recapture, and that number is about 130 million that we are estimating our recapture would increase. So again, with that additional deficit reduction, our projected end-of-year deficit would be around 78 million. This does assume no changes in our average daily attendance, no major changes in property tax protest, or no other large expected new revenue or expenditures. So kind of holding those other items flat. So the options that we want to talk about now are what are other saving options that we can consider, or what could we also then think of doing in place of a Vader? So what are some some items that we know could provide savings for the district.
Yeah, and Jacob, Dr. Reach, if I could kind of pause you for a moment. I think it's important that we communicate to our trustees, to our community, to all of our staff, that we are going to have to go through a process that looks at cost reduction strategies, regardless if a VADER is successful or not. Even with a VADER, there is a deficit that still has to be considered. And so, as we've talked about, over the course of the spring semester, as we move towards the approval of the budget, it is our focus over the next several months to go through a process that identifies where those reductions could be taken, so that when we do go and ask our community, to consider a VADER by way of election, everybody understands kind of what process we have gone through as an organization over the course of 2 fiscal years, so that we're communicating. We have looked internally and turned over every opportunity and identified and exhausted all opportunities, and the path forward is going to be very difficult without kind of these types of considerations. So I just want to be very clear, it's not in lieu of a VADER. Many of these things will still have to be considered if a VADER is successful also.
Thank you. But I do want to stress that the options that we have listed here really are for discussion purposes. They're for illustrative purposes and examples of what could be done. We want to give the idea of what are some of those large cost-saving measures that could be considered in a discussion. For any of these ideas, we want to make sure that we're utilizing our partner Gibson in the joint advisory group that we want to put together as we focus on our long-term budgeting needs, which we will discuss more in the next presentation. Overall, we want to make sure that we're staying true to what makes Austin great, stay aligned to our mission and our vision and our priorities, and ensure that we're considering how we can be visionary in our changes. So most likely, you would not see a whole-scale ending of programs or large across the board, 20% cuts to everything, or even stopping programs that we know are really integral to what makes Austin great and what helps support our students. Instead, we really want to consider how our cost reduction could bring forward some changes that help us on how we do business and how we support our schools and our students. But please note, we do recognize that we do need to take some really strong measures here to address this deficit. As an organization whose overall budget is 89% staffing, with the majority of that being teachers and classified staff, we do know that there's going to have to be some changes that affect our people and campuses. When we think through eliminating or changing programs or changing how we're doing business, we're talking about individual people who we recognize play very important roles in supporting our students. So we really want to ensure that the process that we take is respectful, honors the great things happening at Austin ISD, stays focused on students, but really helps us address being financially compliant with what we need to do for our budget moving forward. So I want to touch on some of these items. Most of these are strong estimates. They're close, but they're not exact. That's why almost all of these are very round numbers. With any of these, if we were to pursue them, there's work that we're going to have to do to kind of go through and understand what that means. And again, I would not expect that that all of these or many of these would be done wholesale. It may be looking at doing these in certain ways at only certain campuses, or how we are supporting or are really ensuring that we're building up certain campuses, certain programs, while seeing how we can find some savings in other areas. But overall, we know that if we were looking at removing elementary planning time, which would currently go back to the original way of doing the essential areas, and then removing those TA positions, that could be about an $8 million savings. Changing staffing at the secondary level with 6 of 8 to 7 of 8 could be around 17 million. If we did that only for non-core, so not touching English, science, social studies, or math, that would be done at about 7 million. Changing staffing ratios would be for those grades that do not have the state mandated student to teacher ratio. And that 4 million reflects basically the increase of 1. So that could be compounded on each other. to build. It's not an exact, 4 times 3. There's a little bit difference of savings while you go up, but you could see that compounding. Same with increasing counselor ratio. That's really talking about like a counselor and what kind of savings we would see if we reduce that. And again, these are items that could be compounded. Changing librarians to aides could see savings because of the difference in position. Eliminating nurses, which is not a required service of a school district, but something that we do believe is important, could provide savings. And then, of course, there are stipends that districts provide that are not legally required or not required by policy, and we believe that that would be around $20 million altogether. Other considerations that we want to think about is just understanding staffing configurations overall. So it may not necessarily be a change in the staffing ratio, but it may be a change in how staff and classrooms are set up. Also understanding how TAs are allocated or reducing support staff or other items that we would want to think through. So these are looking at the campus staffing, looking at some of our academic-related options. One item that we could consider is adopting state curriculum in OER. We know that where we're at right now, math curriculum could be an option for adopting state curriculum. That would provide us about $1 million savings, although it would also require us shifting what we have set up for our math program. Also, by using OER, we could receive $60 per covered student. So depending on what grades we selected, all the students covered by those grades may bring in another $60, and that could be another source that we could pursue. Looking at eliminating non-required buses, we actually have almost $8 million worth of non-legally required buses. I did remove some things like our transportation for Rosedale, our transportation for Clifton. But what you see in here include things like our late buses, our buses to Magnets, our buses to ACC, our crosstown busing, our athletic busing that is not required with UIL, and then those short distance buses that we've added. And that could be about $6 million worth of savings. Thinking of consolidating schools, those vary depending on the size of schools. I think it's fair to say that it's about $1 million per elementary, about $1.5 million per middle school. But we would really have to look at those individual schools to understand that. And I'll share how I came up with that rate. It's not a perfect calculation, but I want to be transparent in what we use to kind of understand what could be some of those savings. So I would look at 2 schools based off a certain size, and then find a school that had similar demographics, but was basically the size of both of those 2 schools put together. So then I added those first 2 schools up, subtracted out the third, and got the difference. Because understanding, for example, if I had 2 schools of 200 and they each cost X amount of dollars, and 1 school of 400 with similar demographics at Y amount of dollars, I could theoretically assume that those 2 schools at 200 put together would cost about the same as that 1 school at 400. So again, it's not an exact science. It would really be one of those things where we'd have to name the school and then work through the staffing at that point. Most of that would, of course, come through reduced staffing, and then there'd be a little bit on reduced utilities and the supplies and materials for that campus. And then, of course, there would also be the option of looking at how you could monetize a vacant building or sell a vacant building. Other items would be eliminating the non-required summer school. That would be about $1.1 million. This is not the students that have to take summer school. It's the enrichment summer school that we currently offer. We can also consider removing magnet allocations at about $1.5 million for all of those campuses. Another thing that we would want to consider is reducing academic programming. That's going to vary, but we would want to start by looking at the enrollment of certain programs and courses and understanding where there may be options to combine, maybe options to give a different option for a student, or just to end a program based off of enrollment. We also wanted to think on what are some of those other things that are not legally required and not that we actually want to bring forward, but we want to better understand what would that mean if we stopped doing those. So for instance, if we just stopped offering CTE at middle school, we could save about $1 million. And that goes above and beyond what we're already required to spend for CTE. So there is a requirement for CTE. This would be what's above that. If we were to end some of our partnerships like Creative Learning Initiative, that would save about another $1 million because of the central positions and then the supplies and materials and funding that's associated with that. If we were to reduce multilingual instruction, this one's a little bit difficult to calculate because no matter what, we have a requirement for bilingual programs for students. But the idea would be that if we were to remove or move away from doing one-way and two-way dual language, there could be some staffing. Again, it's not perfect because it's really difficult to calculate because then it creates new obligations on the district, but somewhere around 1 million. And then if we were to end our early college, high school, and P-TECH programs, so things that aren't grant funded or aren't providing funding from the state, just what we're putting into it, we would see about $1.1 million in savings. Other things to consider would be athletic offerings, fine arts, visual arts offerings, also understanding vertical alignment of our campuses and how there could be some efficiencies with looking at that vertical alignment. So for the last part, I want to talk about just other operational cost. One thing that we are going to work on and work with our partner Gibson is understanding how we could potentially restructure Central. Again, that cost varies, but what I do want to mention is that what we know is central office, the administration that includes HR, finance, my team, the superintendent's team, really anything that's not special education or not school leadership that's directly supporting schools or grounds maintenance and custodial, all of that central office is about 26.5 million. And so I bring that up just to share that, we could remove central office, but it would not still take away the entire deficit that we have. But of course, there would certainly be some impact to the services that we provide. And so that kind of gives an idea of what that cost could look at, but we'll continue to talk through that. Another idea that we've heard is sell or monetize central office. Of course, when we're talking about selling properties, that's something we always want to discuss with trustees and exec. So I'm not going to talk about what any properties may be worth, but we do know in general, just using a standard cost per square foot rental cost, that it is potentially possible to rent floors for around $300,000. But again, that cost is going to vary and it's going to depend on who you're renting with. We also have some other services that are centralized that are not legally required. For instance, community services. This is like our family engagement, our non-parent education parenting programs. So parent education programs are one type. Anything else that's working with parents is what I'm talking about. Child care programs, including child care programs for existing students, after school programs, that's about 8 million altogether. I'm going to jump one real quick before I go to historical. Same with social services is about 3 million. Also understanding that that's a lot of contracted work and internal service providers and social workers. And we do want to, no matter what, continue to try and find additional support from some of our great partners like the City of Austin, Travis County, and Central Health. Ending historical exemptions is another. I do want to mention that most of these would be realized once we've actually implemented it. Historical exemptions is a little different because that's delayed a year. So once we say we want to end that historical property exemption for property taxes, it doesn't go into effect right away. It goes into effect the next full taxable year. So there's a delay on doing historical exemptions, which is part of the City of Austin's program. We also want to look at reducing contracted services. Overall, we have 58 million in non-bond related contracted services. We did reduce some of those this year, and we also believe that we know that some of those are naturally going to reduce because we put a lot of work into our SPED contracted services. But we built up our SPED team, made sure that's a strong team and help supporting our campuses. So some will naturally reduce, but we want to continue to look at what else can be done. And then, of course, just monetizing any of our real estate holdings. We have real estate across the district and how we can look at partners to help bring in money every year, or in some cases look at long-term leases, or in very rare cases perhaps looking at selling a property for that full upfront yet one-time cost. Other things that we want to look at is outsourcing services, new and increased revenue options. The district is wanting to put a focus on increasing attendance, and we know that that's one of the major drivers of how much state funding we get. And so that should bring in some new revenue because of the increased Tier 1. And then, of course, also reducing technology software is a big focus for our technology team. That's both across the district and individually. How we can use some educational software that may be free to us, either through the state or from partners, or limiting redundant software, or just really setting guidelines on what software will be used in the district. So again, I know that like none of these were really great ideas. I'm not saying any of them because I think these are like, let's go do all of this now and then we'll be okay. But we really want to share an idea of what are some of those big things that can be done. You know, I have to share that this district under Ed, under previous CFO, is working with Matthias, especially around a lot of our building efficiencies. Like most districts right now are being like, oh, we're going to do a lot for building efficiencies, and we're going to save millions on this. Well, Superintendent Segura did that years ago on the operations team. Like that low-hanging fruit for us is no longer there. Trying to find some of those efficiencies, we've taken some of those a bit at a time. And so some of those are not already there for us. And so we do need to understand what are some of those other bigger things that we can look at. So I will pause there and turn it back over to our superintendent.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Reach. I appreciate you taking the board and our community through this. And I do want to kind of reiterate, you know, we wanted to be back in, before we approved the budget on June 20th, there were a couple of slides that Ed presented that talked about potential other cost reduction strategies. And there were 5 or 6 bullets, and what we've done here is just expanded that because we know that each of these, plus many, many others, are going to have to be explored and evaluated as we move through this process. And as Dr. Reach just mentioned, all of these things were brought into the district because they serve a purpose, right? A real purpose. And I don't want to lose sight of that. And so any consideration has to be done thoughtfully. This is something that you know, will obviously not be as, we won't have to take as big of a measure cut-wise if a Vader does move forward. And also, these things cannot be implemented overnight, just to be very clear. You know, we're going to go through a process. We'll get through the fall semester. We'll create time for transitions. We view this work and implementation of a plan really a 2-year effort, which is how we really should be thinking about budgets as we move forward, not just 1 year at a time. You know? And so I just wanted to kind of make that point before we open it up to the trustees for any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Trustees, do y'all have any questions? Oh, yes. Trustee Gonzalez.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I appreciate the sentiments and I agree. Like, as a former classroom teacher, looking at some of these things, they're devastating. And I can't imagine, I can, like, not to get too dystopian, but I can't imagine how we wouldn't have a dramatically different district if some of these proposed cuts were to happen. So what would be the total reduction that we'd be aiming for? I know on the slide that had the proposed or the projected deficits at the end of 24-25 with and without the Vader, it was 78 versus 99. So just a ballpark, what would be the total reductions that you're looking at?
So this will kind of, do you want to segue? Well, I mean, I'm debating whether we should go to like both presentations because I feel like maybe that'll help. I don't know, President Singh, if you think it's, I mean, I want to have the Vader conversation, and I certainly want to kind of reinforce the fact that, you know, to take 2 successive years, we really need to be aggressive. You know, the number that you mentioned, which is $78 million, which is presented back in May and then again in June, would ultimately be a target, assuming that state doesn't do anything, the Vader passes, and no additional revenue is generated. I think, logically, and I think from a realistic perspective, we are wanting to do a couple things. We want to we want to identify cost reduction strategies. And just to be clear, these are not proposals. I heard proposals, and I just want to be very clear to our community that we're not bringing this forward as a proposed recommendation for cuts. These are the types of things that we're going to have to explore, which is what I really want to reinforce. And so one goal would be to do, $35 million in cost reduction strategies in fiscal year 24-25, and then another, the same thing in 25-26. Because we know that not all of these cuts can be taken in year one, but at least we'd identify all of the potential cuts over a 2-year period. And so if there was a goal, that would be it. I will say, however, that that is also dependent on us wanting to preserve fund balance for a number of out years. And so one of the strategies that we're exploring is monetizing real estate. And as Dr. Reach just mentioned, there's a variety of ways that you can do that. You can do a revenue stream for X amount of years, decades and decades and decades. You can do a capitalized ground lease where all that revenue is picked up front, and it kind of comes in and offset fixed costs, but only a one-time fixed cost. At the end of the day, it all kind of goes down to the imbalance, which is kind of going to increase your fund balance. So that would be the target at this point.
You're saying that would happen over the course of 2 years?
Correct. Yeah. If we were to do this, and again, it's assuming the state does nothing,
Which is a fair assumption.
it's a very fair assumption. I think there's a question as to whether we could get there as an organization. President Singh and I have had this conversation where my fear, honestly, is that we look at these things, we identify recommendations, we bring them forward, we go through a process with our community and the committee that's going to be developed, and then there isn't consensus to actually follow through with the reductions. I think that is, in my opinion, a very difficult place to be, because then we're really stuck. Which is why I think having the dialogue with the trustees early and often is going to be absolutely critical. Because I absolutely know that there are things in here that are non-negotiable, but when asked, which are these things that we have done and added to support our students, rightly so, but aren't legally required, then to be incredibly transparent, these are what they are. That's what they are. So that would be the target.
Thank you. That's all for now.
Trustee Coffin.
So I know that it's late, and I won't go into detail on any list of specific things here, but I'm curious about one in particular, and that is I've asked before, and I don't recall getting an answer about whether we've evaluated actualized savings from closing schools in the past. So do we have data now that suggests that we're saving $1 million for every elementary school that we closed 5 years ago?
So do we have data from 5 years ago? No. I said several months ago, when I tried to, I think, respond to a question elsewhere similar to this, one of the things that was hard was that, schools were closed in November of 2019, and then we immediately went into a pandemic. And one of the things, when looking back and trying to figure this out, because I've spent time trying to track where those dollars went, it's that it all got absorbed back into the general fund. And then as an organization, we spent, in that period of time, PPE, all these costs were going out. We weren't sure we were going to be reimbursed. So I will say that no.
But
and then
generally
also,
speaking, though, do we have evidence that suggests that in the past any years that closing schools has resulted in an annual savings of money?
So what I have, I guess the way I would say this is, in years past, I don't have anything before 2019. I don't haven't gone back and looked. I'm not sure that we have those records. But I will say that closing a school generally doesn't yield the cost reduction that you would expect. Where I have understood it to actually have an impact is when it's done at scale. When you're doing more than just one, you're doing several schools, is when I've seen that actually yield some cost reductions. The other thing that I'll say is that you can run a very efficient smaller school. Like you can do that, and I think we've done some things appropriately and proving that we can do it that way as well. So I guess to your point, Trustee Coffin, to be more direct, are there direct savings that we can point to historically that we have that came out of a school closure? No, I can't. And for what I described, and also because our system at that point wasn't able to do that, I don't think that closing a school would have a meaningful impact on this.
Right. And
Now, as part of a long-term plan, if the board wanted to consider that, then potentially you could see that, but it'd have to be more than just one.
Okay. I appreciate your comment about this being a list of, not being a proposal.
Correct.
And I think that's incredibly important, and I would even advise perhaps reframing this entirely to say kind of what you said, but I think you provided important context to say there are things that we are legally required to spend money on.
Correct.
That we have to, or that there are baseline things that are not a choice. And then there's a whole array of things that are choices that we choose to do because of our values, our beliefs, because of what our community wants, because of what's best for kids. So there are all sorts of things that we do. And there are a million more things we would do if the funds were unlimited. And so understanding what that middle bucket is, right? And then there are things that we do that are just, there in any organization, there are going to be things that are wasteful, that just don't need to be done. They just happen to happen that way. People, I think, envision that one, sometimes people say that one is huge and we're just being inefficient and we could cut all this fat from the district and we'd be, just cut central office. I like that you use this to debunk the idea that cutting central office, which would devastate the operation of the district, would even solve the problem, right? So that's important kind of information to be able to point to the efficiency, to say, really, there's only this much we can cut by being efficient. Then there's all this stuff in the middle, which is, these are things we could cut, we're not required to do them, right? But but there's a reason we do them, et cetera. But, so I think it's really important, but I just would say, let's not call these options, let's just say, this is what we spend, this is what we choose to spend our money on, so people understand. Because I think what I hope people take from this is, there's a lot of money that our district spends for really good reasons, for really good things that really benefit kids, and that our community wants, and that our kids benefit from, and that help us to keep teachers, which is something we do need, right? And so understanding those things, because it is important to say, wow, where does all that money go? And so I think that, but the challenge I get when I see even the cost-saving options is the comment I got last time, which was from somebody saying, figures, AISD is talking about cutting our department, and we haven't even been involved in that conversation. And this is this is about arts. The AIC is considering cutting arts at schools, and they haven't even brought the topic up with us, right? And so this raised that suspicion, oh my God, they're cutting bilingual education, they're cutting the CLI, they're cutting buses, and we haven't even talked to those departments. So that's not where we're at.
Correct.
Right. So I just want people to understand, none of these things are proposals. I interpret them as, these are things our district spends money on. And if we are going to seriously cut the budget, we have to have conversations about these things.
That's exactly right.
So
That's well said.
So maybe just
we will
take out
make
the
those
word
adjustments and remove options and look at a different way to title that. And I hope I reinforce the fact these are not proposals. To be very, very clear, these are not proposals.
And there are some things that will scare people away, right? So I will just comment on the one that you probably expect me to comment on, which would be, cutting stipends for bilingual and special education, right, would almost guaranteed cause us to lose hundreds of teachers, and at the first available opportunity to surrounding districts that are paying $6,000 to $8,000 stipends for these hard to fill positions. And so, that's the kind of thing where people really need to understand we're That's not a conversation yet, right? If there is a conversation, that conversation will happen.
That's right.
That conversation will happen with the stakeholders, with the people getting it, with Education Austin, with the organizations that support those, with the communities that have kids in those programs. Because the rumor is gonna, I almost guarantee I have emails already that say, oh my God, ASD is gonna cut our budget, our stipends. So just
Yeah,
be
and-
careful, please.
Well, and I think this is where transparency and being cautious, like kind of, we are going to be transparent through this process. When people ask, how does the $950 million operational budget kind of find itself into the system? And you think, okay, well, all we gotta do is cut, 8%. That should be easy. No, it's not, because when you really dig down, these investments that we've made over time, are there for a reason. And so what we wanted to do was to bring them forward, acknowledge that there's going to be a process. We're going to have conversations. None of these are proposals. None of these are recommendations. They're none of those things. But I wanted the trustees to understand that these are things that we are not legally obligated to spend dollars on. But many of them, if not the majority of them, or most of them, in fact, are very much aligned with our values. And I could go through every one of these and defend them, like honestly,
Yeah.
to the end. And that's just something we're gonna have to go through together.
Yeah, and I appreciate, I think it's important for everyone who wants to maintain everything to also understand there are other ways of running a school district. Like that things that people who've been in AISD for a long time take for granted are not the norm in other districts. And so having, small PE sizes, like there are lots of districts that have PE TAs and have large PE classes. There are lots of districts that don't have art programs at all. There are programs there. So there are it helps. I think this is a really helpful exercise. And I appreciate, because we have to, we can't do everything.
And just to reinforce your comment, Trustee Kaufman, each one of these has so many nuances within each line item. They're just, they're in isolation. There's a couple $1 million, but you have to really even get deeper into it. Just looking at buses, late buses to Magnus, point 4. That all gets broken up. So just all that work will continue, and we'll be bringing that forward as well.
Trustee Hunter.
I'm just gonna piggyback on what Dr. Kaufman said. Thank you for the change. I think that will really help people understand. Cause I'm reading a book right now about teaching, and one of the things it says with neuroscience, our brains are 40% more likely to go for the negative. That's what we remember. 40% more likely negative. And as we are, I don't know how, when I sat in the same chair and said people are gonna feel some kind of way before we got to this point, my caution to our public is be still. We have to wait and see, because jumping too soon means you might be trading the witch for the devil. So be still, and we will get through this together. But just like in your family, when you have to say, won't be going to the movies this week. I know we get pizza every Friday, but maybe this week we'll make pizza, right? Same thing, right? Except we're in the millions and not the hundreds. So I really would just ask the public in our community to ask questions if you have them. If you read something online or hear something, try to get to the source, right? If you want to email us about something, email us about that, right? And we can try to get a good answer for you or help you understand. But what we don't want people to do is panic, and then that just starts a flood of things. We don't know where we are yet. So we'll let you know when to panic. We'll tell you break glass in case of emergency. Thank you.
So I have a couple of comments. Thank you. And I just want to share partially how this came about, the idea of having this breakdown of all these costs that are here for illustration purposes. The community, we're going to feel pain, I think, on this dais. I think some of us are already feeling it, but our community really needs to feel it too, quite honestly, so that you understand. We represent y'all, right? And so we need to I want you guys to know what we're thinking about so that you can tell us your thoughts on it. And that's gonna be part B of tonight's presentation, is the process. That's why we wanted to have these two conversations together. Is like, we're gonna have to make a whole bunch of terrible cuts, and we're gonna do it in the way that's like most humane and will cause the least harm. But I actually do, I mean, they are going to happen, we know, like, even if we pass a Vader, we're still gonna have to make how many millions of dollars in cuts?
Well, total,
Yes,
we want to be, between 41 and 50 total.
yeah,
I mean,
million.
Million.
Million,
Over the
yeah.
course of 2 years.
Yeah.
All these things will, and just for context, we took 30 million last year. And that was a process, right? And it was difficult at the end. And so we're talking about kind of that scale, but in future years.
And so this is gonna require, I think, some real conversations with people. And, it's nice that we just adopted our scorecard as well, because I think that's gonna be sort of, a guiding document in all of this. It's not the end all be all, but it is a really important document that we have. At the same time, we have our community's values as well. And so I think it's gonna be this constant, it's gonna be like this merging of two things. And I just hope y'all are up for it, because it's gonna be, it could be transformational in some good ways. Like, it doesn't have to just be doom and gloom. Maybe there are things that we can do totally differently that I don't see on here. But I know I've heard about bubbling up in the community over the last few years, things like, hey, maybe there's a way we could do our CTE programs so they're not so redundant, that we have so many programs at so many different campuses, but we have like centers in different parts of our city, things like that. But all of that, even, it's not like you can flip a switch and it just happens, right? So it's gonna, I think, require patience and a lot of focus, a lot of discipline, and a lot of listening to our community, and at the same time keeping in mind like what we have adopted on our scorecard, and thinking about how all of that would be impacted along the way. But I did want to ask Ed, so if we were to add up all the things that you actually have dollar amounts next to in this table, what would that add up to?
Do you have that total?
Yeah, we'd have-
Approximately.
I don't think we did that. Well,
I know I asked Jacob to do that,
well,
but.
there's a lot that varies.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that
so
are pretty big
let's
numbers.
take out the varies and just say the things that actually have dollars amounts. If
Do you want to ask another question while we do the math, or do you want to?
no, this is for dramatic pause. This is a dramatic pause.
So as I mentioned, a few of these compound upon one another, but I didn't do any compounding. So it'd be 80 million.
Okay, so if we did every single thing
And that
that's-
didn't include school closure either.
Okay, so if we did everything that's on this list that has a specific dollar amount, that'd be $80 million, which would close our deficit, correct?
Yeah, 78, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we did, correct.
But that would close our deficit even if we passed a Vader.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay, so I just want to make sure people understand that. Even if we pass Matthias said it earlier, even if we pass a Vader, we're gonna have to make cuts. If we did every single thing on this list that has a dollar amount next to it and passed a Vader, that's what it would take for us to have a balanced budget. Now imagine if we don't pass a Vader, it would be even worse than this. This is just to paint a picture. Obviously, these aren't proposals, but the whole point of this exercise tonight is for people to be in this headspace of yeah, we're gonna have to make some really, really, really hard decisions. And, And I think about like how good we have, like we've been such fiscal stewards. I think about like our bond rating, our first rating. We have the highest ratings across the board. So it's not like we've been spending money willy-nilly and been irresponsible. We have actually been super responsible. And we're still in this position.
Yeah, I think it just kind of reinforces, the impact of increasing fixed costs when no revenue increases. If you have 3% increase year over year and your operating budget's almost $1 billion, you're gonna see $30 million in additional cost every single year. And so that is really what we're fending off. It's just the cost of education, market conditions, escalation, all of those things. And to your point, that also assumes the state does nothing, which there's historical evidence that is very likely the case.
Thank you. Steve Oswald?
Yeah, thank you for all of this. Really appreciate it. It's an incredibly painful conversation to have, and I appreciate the conversation that this is just a very transparent list of the kinds of things that we're going to have to explore and talk about as a community. I really believe that the harder our choices become, the more important it becomes to bring our community in. So thank you for really bringing people into the reality of this. And I think it's also really important to point out these are the kinds of things that not only us in Austin ISD, but every district across the state is being forced to consider and grapple with, and in some cases do. And we know that there are districts that are increasing class sizes, that are limiting planning periods, that are closing many campuses, that are cutting programs for students, that are making really, really difficult choices that are not in service of the students that we are all here to serve. And that we have legal obligations of the state to serve. And we know that we in Austin ISD, for very good reasons, do a lot of things that go beyond what the state requires. And we know that if we look only at what the state requires, it is a really limited vision of what education can be. And I think we need to name that, and I think our what we strive for as a community, as a board, as an administration, as an organization, is to do better, to do more than that, to really reflect our values. And this is part of that, and it's painful. I think for me personally, what I see in this is that as painful as a copper penny election might be, that I am ready to go there. I am ready to have that conversation and to really take this to our community. It is the only tool we have left under the school finance system to increase the funding available to our schools. Will it increase it enough to do everything we know our students need? No. Will it make it better than it is? Yes. Even with the pain of the extra recapture, even with all of that. And I really appreciate Dr. Reach, and would love to put the slide up again, of our legislative advocacy priorities that we adopted in June. The fact that we are not doing this, we are not talking about this in isolation, we are talking about this in alignment with very specific advocacy priorities that are not just ours, but that are shared by many districts around the state. I will be at a board meeting of the Texas Association of School Boards later this week. And we have also proposed resolutions to that body. They have school funding priorities. We have also, as a board, proposed resolutions to that body that will be considered that address a lot of these things, looking at the impact of recapture on housing affordability, talking about attendance-based funding rather than enrollment-based funding, talking about the basic allotment, talking about a lot of really essential things, making sure that the state is fully funding the security mandates that they have created that are costing us more, far more, millions more than we are receiving. So I really think it's important to say, we're not just talking about coming to our community with our hand out. We're not just talking about slashing things that we care about deeply, that we know are good for our kids, but we are also taking other kinds of action. And we know that is something that our community values, and that it's not just us alone in Austin who want these things. So thank you for that. And thank you for sharing this information as we talk about the hard choices we make locally, the bigger issues as well. I have a couple of questions for you, Dr. Reach, but I didn't see in the presentation that I do think are valuable for our community. One is that there is a lot of conversation out there in the media, in some places, among Texas state leaders, in some places, that school budget crunches are not due to choices from the state, that they're due to, we went nuts with the ESSER funding, hired 1 billion people that we want to keep. We've been really irresponsible, and now we just don't want to make the cuts. Can you help me understand what that is and isn't? I know we talked about that earlier in the summer, but for anyone who didn't watch that meeting or didn't remember, I would love to remind people kind of how many people we did and did not hire using our ESSER funds and what we've done with those positions. And it's fewer than 24, if I recall.
That's correct, and if I'm not mistaken, every employee that was hired with ESSER funds was hired on a timed basis. So there was an understanding that this was work for a year, for 2 years. It was not, here's a brand new allocation to a campus. And so most of our funding was spent on supporting what the state calls accelerated learning, providing that additional support for students, whether that was through summer school or during the school year. It helped with a lot of our technology transition, which was a one-time cost. So those were not recurring costs for us. There were some software that was recurring costs, but we knew that there was an end to some of that, and that this was during this time period, and then we would look at other options. So we as a district did not create any recurring cost through our ESSER. And so I would disagree that, at least for Austin ISD, and for many other districts as well, although not every district, that ESSER is not the reason. I do believe that if I were to ask, like, what's a strong reason on why we're in this, it's inflation plus not having any adjustment related to that. Inflation has taken, in cost of living and trying to keep up with cost of living for staff, has taken up so much of this. I mentioned earlier that 89% of our budget is in staff. Only 11% is in other things. And so when we give cost of living increases just to keep up with it, which don't even always keep up with inflation, that's just trying to ensure that our staff can live where they work and can be supported in these communities, and that we can recruit new staff. And so I think that that's really what we're looking at, is just that we have a finance system that's not keeping up with the inflation that we're experiencing. I don't know the exact dollars, but we've heard it even with our bond, how inflation has even affected our bond spending. And our bond team has been so great at trying to account for all of that. And there's still situations to where we're like, oh, it's even gone up higher than we thought. And the same is true with a lot of our 199 costs that we have. Our insurance went up how much, Ed?
End up over $1 million.
Yeah. So that's a cost that we can't, I couldn't list it here because I'm not allowed to say that we're not going to pay our insurance or we're not going to pay our bills. But those are costs that we have to pay that we're unaccounted for. And then you mentioned some other things like the safety and security. So the state did put requirements on us, and while they did provide a little bit of money, it was not enough for any district in the state to cover what the new requirements were. And then I think that there are some similar things with, I mentioned the accelerated learning. And, we had ESSER funding to help with that, and that was helpful, but ESSER funding has ended. We still need to continue to help support our students through that accelerated learning program. So that's another cost for our district. So I would put it first on inflation and the funding not keeping up with inflation.
And Trustee Bowles, another example that we can point to, I know Jacob just asked Chief Ramos about insurance, but another one that is very easy to point to is utility costs. So one of our largest line items in our budget is utility costs, and we've become more efficient. Our maintenance and operations expenditures have gone down as a function of just repairs, and our efficiency has gone up, but the cost per kilowatt hour has gone up. And so what we've saved, we've essentially kind of given back due to the increasing rate. And I know everybody in our community has also seen that. We're about to experience another one. And so those are the sorts of things that we have to account for, and they're not in here because you have to pay the electric bill, you know.
Sure. And I'm sorry, I want to add one that I did not include on this spreadsheet, but I thought through it, but I can't, and I'll explain why, and that's special education cost. The state does provide us some funding for special education, about $50 million. We're spending $170 million on special education. So there's a difference of $120 million of what the state has told us would be adequate to cover special education needs and what we're actually paying. But I can't list it as an option because we have maintenance of effort that we have to maintain. And so that would be disingenuous for me to say that we can cut $120 million in SPED. It's not possible. So it wasn't worth me listing. That's another example, you know, aligned again to our legislative priorities of ensuring that the funding for special education is actually aligned with the needs of students.
Thank you all, each of you, for all of that, and really understand that our families are understanding. If you had the same amount of money that you had in 2019 and you were paying your utility bills, your fuel costs, your food costs, your insurance costs without an increase in that amount, you were feeling the same thing at home as we are feeling as a district. So I appreciate that, and Dr. Reach, really appreciate that illustration about the special education funding too, and again, we're talking about what we're feeling that's being shared across the state, and I know there is a bigger than $2 billion gap in what the state offers to districts allocated for special education and what districts are spending on our students, so thank you for that. I have a second question that I didn't see in the presentation, but want to be sure we share with our community. I hear from people a lot, why don't we just not give recapture, or what if we kept some of our recapture? And I would love to make sure, just in the shortest possible way, help people understand the money we give to recapture does not mean that we as a district have less to spend per student, that the formulas give us the same amount as everyone else per student. It just means that we pay a lot more to get there. And if we ended recapture, we wouldn't suddenly have twice as much to spend in our schools.
Yeah, not without other changes to the Tier 1 portion of the foundation school program. And so, you know, I would provide two brief stories. Recently, we know of two districts, Houston most recently, but Wimberley ISD before that, who did go out and ask, what if we just don't pay recapture? And the state has other mechanisms that they can do to look at addressing districts who may be raising more than what the state formulas say they're entitled to. So for Houston ISD, the state was looking at actually detaching property from the district. For Wimberley ISD, they were actually looking at freezing funds for the school district. Both of those districts are now paying recapture. So the state does have mechanisms just to ensure that that goes through. But as you say, whether we pay more recapture or less recapture has no effect on the total amount that we get to spend on our students. Now, why our tax base goes up, we do also see some increased revenue because of those golden pennies. But the recapture itself makes no difference. Likewise, recapture going up or going down makes no difference on what any other district receives because the state formula dictates what that is. As we say, and as our legislative priority has on here, I think all of us would be really happy if the state said, hey, every dollar that comes from recapture, we're going to put on top for public education, and then it'll go out to all schools. We'd all say, like, hey, we're paying a lot more, and that's tough, but we get the point, and we see how that's benefiting Texas public education overall. But that's not what's occurring. And so I think that how it is occurring now, there is real need for reform for that system.
Thank you. I would agree with that. Thank you for that explanation. So I really appreciate everyone showing up to have a meeting in July when we tried really, really hard not to have a meeting in July. Would say just to my colleagues, I'm ready to give this very strong consideration and really to say to our community, I'm really eager to hear from you sharing with us how you feel about what we're discussing, about bringing a tax rate election to our community. So again, this is a hard decision. It's not one that I'm ready to make, in isolation as a board, but we're having this meeting as part of a dialogue with our community. So please share with us where you are, how you're feeling, what your questions are. I think we have had opportunities to ask questions. We'll have opportunities to ask more, and we want those questions from our community as well as we make this decision together. So thank you.
Trustee Zapata, did you have any questions or comments? Okay. So I guess I'll go back around. Anyone else have anything to add to this? I would like to ask our superintendent to.
I'd actually like to.
Oh, yeah.
Ask.
Forgot.
Mm-hmm. And I see Trustee Whitley Chu as well. So first, can I be heard? Can you hear me? Okay. So a couple of comments. One is that there are things that we do that almost go unnoticed that other districts don't do. And I really appreciate Trustee Kaufman sort of lifting that up in a sense. There, we choose a particular investment in bilingual education. We choose to spend more on transportation to get a student to school if there are specific instances where that particular walk is perilous. We choose, and you can just go down a huge list. And I like that Superintendent Segura said, you can go down the list of the things that we spend on where there is a darn good reason for each and every one of them. And the administration's choice to sort of present that list to us, however we choose to word it, and we can fine tune the wording. It says something about Austin, being in Austin and being from Austin and having a vision that reflects Austin really means something. So the transparency here tonight, I think, is exemplary. And part of what it shows is that there is a gap between what we need and what is left after the state's thievery. So we're trying to deal with the gap that is left. And I have some big problems because I see it almost as untenable, that you can't close the gap. When you present something where we say, hey, if we go ahead and just cut off our left leg, we'll go from a $99 million deficit to a $78 million deficit. I'm wondering how many legs do we have to cut off? We get to a point where I'm not really understanding how, and I'm not a lawyer, but how it is legal and defensible to objectively, by just the microeconomics of it, put a district in a position where it is impossible to meet what the Texas Constitution says is supposed to happen, which is that we are to provide an efficient education to our students. So at some point, we need to ask the question, maybe even going beyond, well, what happens if we hold recapture? What happens if we say to the state, this needs to be contested in a more fundamental way? If you're setting somebody up, if you're giving them slow drip poison, death is death. I think it's still illegal to murder people. So there's a fundamental problem here that goes above our conversation. The next thing I want to point out, and this isn't going to be pleasant, from a standpoint of the governance of our school board, 18 months ago, we chose to turn down $81 million in funding, where none of that funding would have come from our community. That funding would have come from payments from a corporation that in exchange would get tax breaks. And those tax breaks would not have hurt us at all. We would have received dramatic benefit, $8 million a year. We would have received interest in sinking funds. We would have received all these funds. And we said we didn't want to do that because we didn't want to give a corporation a tax break. But now what we're seriously considering is taking badly discounted money, not from well, the corporation wasn't even from a corporation, but from our community. We're going to take $170 million from our community to give 130 of it to the state and to net out for our community, for our students, 41 million. Trustee Hunter said, trading out the witch doctor for the devil. This is putting the devil on payroll. This is saying that moving forward, what we're going to do is each year we're going to go ahead and give the devil an extra 130 million so that they can build a border wall or so they can do whatever they want to do with their money. So one side of the ledger has me not understanding what we're even talking about here. These copper pennies. I guess one question, for our Mr. Ramos, the copper pennies are subject to the same recapture rate or an accelerated recapture rate. Hopefully it's the same.
The copper pennies are subject to the same recapture rate.
Okay, so when we go out and get these copper pennies, maybe we can call them poison pennies, because for every penny we collect, we keep 25 cents and give 75 cents to the devil. So with these poison pennies, our deficit goes from 99 million to 78 million, and we still have dramatic cuts to make. I guess of the administration, part of what I would ask is there a clear plan that gets us the rest of the way down to deficit reduction? Because if we're just like asked to fill a bucket and we're just like spitting into a bucket and asked to fill it, I'm not really seeing how this dramatic choice to raise our own taxes, to leverage our money in such an inefficient way, if we're going to do that, I need to see a plan that gets us to a balanced budget. But I'm not really seeing how it's possible to even get anywhere near balancing things out with this huge dramatic cut. Like I said, it's like cutting off your left leg, and only so many appendages left. So what would the administration say in terms of the plan forward that actually has this dramatic move be a meaningful move that is part of a plan that gets us to balanced? And that is a question.
So Trustee Foster, it's a process. We are not at a point where we're going to give a recommendation on cuts. As we discussed before we moved to the board approval of the budget on June 20th, the process and the plan that we'll be discussing here in a moment is that we go through a process which will bring recommendations before the board in late September, early October, preferably before the October information session, to be presented at the October information session. That plan will have multiple phases in it. Again, I said that all of these cuts, any reductions cannot be taken in this current fiscal year, that it's going to be a multi-year process. My hope would be to identify at least $30 million in this existing fiscal year to be considered for next, and then $40 million the following year. You can go, 35. There's ways that you can do it, but generally speaking, you want to split it in a meaningful way that will also allow us to get through the next legislative session to see if anything changes at that point. Now, my hope is that before the election takes place in early November, we as an organization will have been able to present phase one cost reduction strategies, and then phase two, which will be implemented in the following fiscal year. I would say that the phase two cuts would probably lack a little bit of detailed implementation, because the big unknown at that point would be, is anything going to change in the legislative session in spring of 2025, right? So if weights get adjusted, if somehow copper pennies turn to golden pennies, whatever may occur, that would reduce our reliance on that second phase of cuts, if that makes any sense. So that's how we would approach it. Yes, we are going to be pulling in representatives from all of our advisory committees to participate in a kind of consortium of sorts to provide input through this process. I will also tell you that we've engaged with Gibson, who is the auditor identified by the board, to assist the administration through this process, but working actually very, very closely with the superintendent's office and our finance department and Jacob Reach, Chief of Government Relations and Board Services. This is really in an effort to explore those things that are kind of re-envisioning how we operate. Back in May and June, I said a couple different times that it is very difficult to get to where we need to be by cutting around the existing systems. In many ways, we have to rethink the existing system to yield the reductions that we're needing to explore. And we're going to start with central office. I've been clear about that. We've started some of that work already. We'll expand from there. But that we do have a plan, Trustee Foster. Some of that will be discussed in the next presentation. But again, multiple phases, 2-year process, recommendations by late September, early October. We'll understand shortly thereafter if the VADER is supported by the board and does move forward. It will be voted on in early November. Then that gives us the end of fall semester to finalize the implementation of phase 1. Spring 2025, we're implementing phase 1 kind of plan while the legislative session is going on. We close out the year and adopt the 25-26 budget, and then move into phase 2, but we'll make adjustments on our phase 2 recommendation because at that point, hopefully there's some understanding or knowledge of what the state's gonna do from a funding perspective. You mentioned a good one, right? Safety and security allotment. I mean, right now, we're having to take that cost on. If the state comes back and says, okay, we're gonna make an adjustment on the safety and security allotment, then all of a sudden that second phase, the phase that I think is gonna be harder, right, to implement, those things that are closer and closer to being an appendage, maybe don't have to get implemented in the same way. So really I would view it as a 2-phased, multi-year approach, but we're going to have to make recommendations and decisions in the near future. So I don't know if that was helpful, but hopefully some of the information in the following presentation and even future meetings will also provide detail on it.
No, that's actually super helpful. Hearing about the phases, hearing about the reality of detail up front, and then it's going to necessarily get a little vague because the number of variables kind of increase and things can change. Hearing about not just cuts, but restructuring, that's exactly what, I'm just one person, what I would need to hear to get along and to appreciate something that's absolutely vomitous in terms of where we sort of are. And I appreciate and actually admire the way you're thinking this through, wherever I land on this in the end. And I do have comments for later, or questions for later about the budget conversation piece of it and cuts. But the punchline is going to be the clarity of vision behind cuts and behind restructuring. So we don't just kind of willy-nilly jump in and say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? That before we get into that conversation, we say, here's our vision and here are our values. And we want the process that we'll enter to be anchored in some pre-thought around vision and values. I appreciate this board so much, and I appreciate the administration so much in this process. So I want to be clear that any venom that I choose to spew in this, and I have plenty, is really flatly directed at the state and the position that they're putting us in, the betrayal of students that they just willfully engage, and that's having us meet in July to consider things that we shouldn't be having to consider. So thank you all. And thank you, President Singh, for giving me a moment to ask some questions.
And Trustee Foster, I very much appreciate your comments. And before we move on, I do want to highlight one point. And when we talk about cuts, we're talking about reduction of fixed costs. salaries, and as Jacob Reach just said, or Dr. Reach, that the majority of our budget is our fixed costs. But you also, the board also asked the administration several weeks ago, if not a month and a half ago, to also explore creative solutions around monetizing real estate. And so, these things will be occurring in parallel, but I want to just reinforce to our board and to our community that, when those things are executed, they will make their way into the budget. But capital injections, get absorbed and considered in that fiscal year and then get netted out. And so really we're going to have to be balancing out, how a capital injection, how that may kind of play differently than a long-term revenue stream, because we'll have those opportunities. And these take time, but we have the skill set and we have the expertise in-house and with our partners to execute them. But all of that kind of comes into play at the same time, if that makes any sense, Trustee Foster, because you take cuts and you want to be very, very thoughtful in how we do it. You want to make sure that you have an understanding of each upcoming variable and you have a strategy to mitigate that risk. But then each capital injection by way of real estate or monetization or anything else is also going to have to find its way into the budget timeline-wise, and will have an impact on our fund balance, which then kind of positions you well for the next fiscal year to then carry on the conversation or maybe even explore additional solutions. So I just want to be very, very transparent. Like, this is also going to consider real estate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Foster. And Trustee Whitley-Chu, did you have any comments or questions?
Yes, briefly, I apologize for my voice. And I'm looking at all the numbers and the cost to us, and not having this additional revenue will be devastating to our student outcomes. And the cost, it's going to impact everyone in our community. And I think we have to move forward and bring this option because our children's future is worth it. So that's just briefly where I'm at. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I wanted to ask our superintendent if you could, looking at slide 10, you gave a very elegant explanation of the rationale for putting $17 million into compensation and $3.5 million into instructional coaches and, staff that are directly going to be serving our students. And I just wanted to ask you to kind of give us a little hope and your vision for the Vader expenditures.
So elegant, did you say elegant?
Yes, it was elegant.
This was from a conversation earlier today. And so, yes, I think it's very important that we talk about the fact that there's infinite need and limited resources. And so if we do have additional resources identified by way of a Vader, being very, very strategic in how those resources are allocated. And so during really largely the part of the spring semester, we spent time with our partners in Education Austin identifying a compensation plan that was not dependent on the existing budget, but would be brought forward and approved if the Vader was ultimately approved by our voter. And one of the things that I want to point out is the compensation plan was founded out of the TASB study that evaluated, which of our staff within Austin ISD are out of alignment with the market. And this is important because when you think about educators, we know, and we've shared multiple graphs over the last couple years, that over the time that an educator is with us, from time zero when they first on board with AISD, all the way through 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years of time with us, we get out of kind of scale with the competition around Central Texas. And so early on, if you look at where we are, and I always kind of use my arm, we're competitive, and we're all, us and the other central school districts within the school districts within Central Texas are kind of all bunched together, but we're competitive. Where we are not competitive is later on, at 5, 10, 15 plus years. And so one of the things that I think is really important to note in the compensation plan is that it does make adjustments to those staff that are tenured educators. And when you think about, the cost of retaining an educator, you think about the cost of, attracting and actually bringing in educators to support our students. It is something that is very resource dependent. It takes a tremendous amount of just dollars, right, to do well. And so the compensation plan for the first time really attempts to increase the slope to where we stay in market and actually are competitive for those educators later on, 5, 10, 15 years of experience, and they don't leave Austin ISD. And I think that's a step in the right direction. The other thing that I'll point out is that it also does include a 25-cent increase to classified staff. It's very, very expensive to live in Austin, as Dr. Reach just mentioned. We want those who serve Austin ISD to be able to live in the community that they serve, and that's almost impossible to do with just the cost of living nowadays. And yes, we've made some significant strides. We were at a little over $14 3 years ago. We moved to $16.50, and then last year we moved to the $20 for base compensation, and this is just another 25-cent minimum. There'll be some adjustments, but 25-cent minimum. And then the other thing that it also does is that other staff, they're out of market because of compression. SLPs is something we've talked about. Those get back into alignment, ends up being a healthy increase, which makes it competitive. But it does not compensate positions that are higher up in the organization. And I know that, just to be transparent, that's one of the things that is not included in this. And that's appropriate. That's where we need to be. Now, as far as staffing of critical positions or critical needs that we have as an organization, you've heard us talk a lot about MTSS, multi-tier systems of support, the fact that we have a lot of new educators over the last couple of years that have moved into Austin ISD that really need support in Tier 1 instruction, and that's where our instructional coaches come in. And we made a commitment last year to hire instructional coaches. And we've seen positive outcomes from that, but the one thing that we need to consider moving forward is the supports around Tier 2 and Tier 3. And that's by way of content interventionists, which is included kind of in this line item. And so that'll help us in a variety of different ways, not only alignment with the TA agreed order, but it'll help us really ensure that MTSS is done with fidelity across the system. We know right now that there are some schools that have a disproportionate number of students that are needing to receive Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction, and we do not have the resources to provide it currently. And so the VADER will help us do that. Special education, we've increased the number of educators who are certified. I think the thing that we are mindful of is that we need to make sure that we place and we hire and we align correctly, and so we're providing some support for that. And then mental health. It's been a focus of ours for a while now. We're trying to ensure that we support our initiatives that we've developed and continue to expand them. We know that 2 years ago we doubled the number of licensed mental health professionals. We're still not in alignment with our counselor to student ratios. There's work to be done there, but we've done a lot, and there's a lot more to do. And so but we want it to be really tight. Like, we're not adding staff just without thoughtfulness or kind of strategic alignment with a goal within Austin ISD or a strategy. And so that's why we're very, very clear. Like, these are the positions in the categories that will be funded by way of new position in the VADER. And then lastly, the offset of fixed cost reduction, and that's just the difference of those two costs netted out of the available revenue that's provided by the VADER, and then that would go to offset that fixed cost that continues to increase by 3% every year. So probably not as elegant as earlier today, but really wanted to kind of talk about kind of where we are, and we made investments in our staff 2 years ago and last year, and we have seen those numbers improve significantly. And I know that, in the very near future, we'll be sharing that. But these are leading indicators. They're things that we often talk about. And I think you cannot be a successful organization and have high student outcomes if you don't have educators. And you can't have educators unless you compete and you support them and you provide the resources and you have a collaborative working environment and you support them. And there's just all these things that come into it. And this is just part of that process. So.
Thank you, Matthias. A couple other things. So I just wanted to add, okay, so Jacob, thank you for reminding us how underfunded we are with special education. Is that because IDEA is not fully funded, even though that is a federal law? Can you speak a little bit to that, or is that a federal issue, or is that like a state level funding issue?
I think the difference in funding is probably more aligned with the state, but certainly the federal government provides some funding for SPED as well. But the main driver is the Tier 1 funding that comes for special education for a school district. Okay. And the weights that are associated with that. And there's actually been adjustments to the weights in 2019, but they're still not directly associated with the actual needs of those students and the services that are needed to be provided for those students. So when a student determines that they need a one-on-one, that does not mean that the state's now giving us enough money to cover a one-on-one for that student. But that's a requirement that we have. In addition, we do things that we know are right. So, I'll be the first to admit there's a couple items that I could have put on this chart that I didn't. Like, as bad as all these were, I couldn't bring myself to say we would close Rosedale as an option. But that's not a requirement for a school district. Yeah. That's something that we do because we know it's best for those kids. Yeah. And Rosedale has very high cost. Yeah. And the cost that we pay for those students is not what we receive from the state. It's not even close. Yeah. Same with Clifton. Another item that I could have put on there. I apologize. Couldn't bring myself. I had to leave some things off.
I appreciate that.
But so it really is about the state funding aligning with that need. I think you actually heard some legislators talk about this last year. And there was a work group who talked about those needs for special education. And that work group did say that it's not aligned with what the funding that's available to the needs that's there and to what's happening at these districts. It's not aligned. And so I think that the information's out there. Yeah. And so I'm hopeful that that's something that could be considered by our state in this next legislative session. As Superintendent Segura said, I think safety and security will be. I think, I really hope that SPED will also.
Yeah, because I remember last time, you probably know this, Secretary Boswell, isn't IDEA funded only at 14% or something of what it should be?
Yeah, so it has a funding formula in it, and it basically says here's what should be funded, but then there's a funding note. So it's not like our state system to where the formula drives how much money needs to be put into it. Yeah. In the federal government, it has a formula, but then it has a funding note, and those two don't have to be connected to each other.
It's absurd. Yeah. A couple other things I just kind of want to highlight is we have had, because we offer so much in AISD that goes above and beyond. I mean, it shows up in our numbers. We have 80% of the student share in Austin, which is crazy high for an urban school district. And I know that under Matthias's leadership, we have had a huge drop in attrition, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Our retention rate for staff has skyrocketed. We've been able to fill vacancies. We lost about a third of our teachers during COVID. And we've been able to, fill our positions pretty well. So there's just so many good things that have been happening. I'm going to be supporting this Vader because the risk to not do it is too high. And I've heard you say many times, this is the success of Austin is really based on the success of Austin ISD. They're intertwined, and we just gotta, you know, we have to see, yeah, this is totally imperfect, and we have to see, like, you know, balance. You know, it's a moral question. It's a practical question, and it's unfortunate that we're gonna have that. You know, we have to even consider this. But I appreciate all the thought that's gone into it, and I know it's not going to be a decision that we take lightly. So, anyone else? All right. So now I think we can shift gears a little bit. Thank you, Ed and Jacob and Superintendent. I think now we're actually going to talk about the long-term budget planning work and discuss a new committee to help us review this work. So, Matthias.
Absolutely, and we're gonna, Ed and Jacob will be staying up here with us. Many of the things that we were gonna discuss in this presentation we've already covered, so I think it'll be an abbreviated presentation. But if we could pull it up. And so I'll kick it off here. Last year, the budgeting process, you know, really started in earnest, you know, February timeframe, and really we had no people, trustees. Sorry, I shouldn't be, not people, trustees. And so one of the things that y'all are people too. One of the things that we're endeavoring to do is to commit to have an ongoing conversation with the board regarding the budgeting process, because we never want to be in a position where we're making difficult decisions very late. And because of where we are, what we've committed to doing is to go through a budgeting process that identifies potential reductions in 2 phases. I just spoke about that in the previous item. But the hope is that before we enter the 25-26 fiscal year budgeting process, we understand what cost reductions we're going to be considering. I never want to put the board in a position where we're having to take on like really big things without enough runway or without a thoughtful process to get it done. So what we're trying to do is to start this year, right, really in August, end of July, but when I say year, I'm talking about our fiscal year, with this modified process. And we had a difficult time kind of naming it, but it is a long-term budgeting process. We really want to get in the habit of planning 2 years at a time. And the hope is between now and October, we'll be identifying different opportunities for reductions, bringing to the board perhaps creative solutions for revenue generating opportunities, whether it's one-time or reoccurring. And the hope is that by the time we get to October, we've identified what those reductions could be in 2 phases. The first phase to be kind of built out and planned over the course of the end of fall semester, initiated over the spring semester. At that point, we would receive more information from the state legislature as to what we could consider as part of the 25-26 budgeting process. But assuming nothing changes, then we would be taking on phase 2, which would be things that are harder to consider, for lack of a better word. And as Trustee Foster just mentioned in the previous presentation, you know, the further that we get through any timeline, the more unknowns that become known. And so if the VADER is successful, then that'll set one path. If the VADER is not successful, then it'll be a different path. And we'll go through this process, and then we'll start the 25-26 budgeting process in earnest really in November. So that's kind of what it's going to look like over the course of the year. We'll be coming back to the trustees probably with one formal update via information session, and then we'll also sprinkle in updates by way of the superintendent's update, which we've done in the past, I think, successfully. And again, the commitment to just make sure the board is always understanding and our community is understanding where we are in each of these processes. And so this is specifically around the process that we're going to move through together over the next couple months prior to this November 1. And so, Jacob, do you want to kind of run us through the first slide?
Yeah. So I want to start by kind of sharing some current context. So looking at this 24-25 budget year, we are starting with a budget deficit, non-Vader, of around 119 million. We know that we can expect around 20 million in vacancy savings, and that's just due to the amount of time that it takes to hire staff or when new vacancies occur and that time goes by. That savings typically will bring about $20 million a year. We also, as we discussed earlier, that potentially looking at a Vader would decrease the deficit initial 20 to 21 million because of that increased revenue that we have. Right now, we're also looking at a $258 million fund balance that is allocated and assigned and unassigned. And then overall, after we subtract out those dollars, that we would need to find about 78 million over the next 2 years in reduction. We believe that we can find around 48 million for year one, and that's something that we want to look towards. It's not a hard goal, but it is something to help guide us and to help keep us on track. When we consider the board's 20% policy for our unassigned fund balance, we do want to recognize that we will have to find about 36 million to make sure that we do not drop below that fund balance. And so that's also kind of that minimum that's on our mind. All of this does assume no additional funding from the state.
And so this slide shows a historical snapshot of our fund balance, where we've ended from the 18-19 school year through the 22-23 school year, and then where we are projecting to end from the 23-24 school years through the 27-28 school years. This also assumes that these projections are, of course, with no Vader taken into consideration. So as Dr. Reach said, for the 23-24 school year, we projected to end the year with a $258 million unassigned fund balance. One of the important notes is for the 24-25 school year, the black line shows our 20% unassigned fund balance policy. So for 24-25, we are projected to be right at our fund balance policy. And so when we talk about looking at reducing our overall expenditures in the out years, you'll see that in 25-26, if we don't make any changes to our expenditures, we are not going to meet our fund balance policy. And so that's why these conversations that we're going to have over the next several months are going to be very critical, because our goal is to really make sure that we meet our fund balance policy over the next several years, at least over the next 2 legislative cycles. And so it's very important to make sure that we continue to be financially stable as a district, to make sure that we continue to meet our local fund balance board policy.
So while we think through the upcoming year, we do have some overlapping work going on. We want to start this conversation around realignment and long-term budget planning and understand what actions we need to take to create that strong financial position going forward. At the same time, we are, of course, working through our 24-25 budget. And Mr. Ramos and his team will bring forward financials. They'll bring forward amendments as necessary, and that work is ongoing. Starting in September, October, the budget development for next year starts. And so our realignment needs to start putting together good work and good ideas so that when we start budget development, we already know kind of what we're working with. We don't want those to be unaligned or disconnected, because then our budget could start planning for something that we're planning something completely different with realignment, or just won't meet what our financial constraints show us is the reality at that time. We also, of course, want to mention that this next school year does include a legislative session year. That'll start in January. We'll go at least through May, through the very beginning of June. Potentially could have special sessions that go longer. But that, every time there's a legislative session, that really plays into our budget development as well. We have to ensure that that budget is set for whatever legislation is requiring us to do the next year. And likewise, if there is any additional funding, whether it's safety and security or anything else, how that aligns as well. So all of this has to work together in tandem with one another. When looking just at some of our realignment work, of course, we want to start with the budget being approved on June 20th. But starting this week, really working with that realignment process and finalizing a selection of a committee is what we're calling it. I think the term we came up with is a joint, I'm sorry, Allie, you're going to have to remind, oh, Allie stepped away. Joint advisory. Thank you so much. A joint advisory committee. And so as Superintendent Segura mentioned, we want to ask for volunteers from all of our various board and superintendent advisory committees to be part of this work, so that we're bringing in lots of different voices. And then likewise, we're hoping that they'll go back to their committee and share out, here's what we're discussing, here's what we're going through, what else do we need to be thinking about. So on August 6th, we hope to do an orientation for that committee. We'll go through a similar presentation with them and kind of talk through what we see in this process, and then understand from them what are some of the other things we need to prepare for. Around that same time, the board will potentially be calling for a VADR at some point. And then of course, school starts on August 20th. I was speaking with Dr. Hawley yesterday, and one thing we want to do before we really get into the work is ensure that we have time to talk through some of the equity essentials for this district and the equity planning process for this district. So Dr. Hawley and her team will help assist us with providing a training on August 27th for that committee, which will then bring us into September. We'll plan on meeting every Tuesday in September to start going through some of this work. We are hoping that we can wrap up this work in September 20th, or at least get to a point to where we have stuff that we can start working from and start building into our budgeting process. And make sure that that work is then really embedded, and like I said, they're all connected. And so have something to start sharing with the board, sharing with the public on where we're at. If needed, we'll continue the conversation, but that's something we'll discuss in committee around that time. And then of course, November 5th would be, well, it'll be election day no matter what, but it could be a potential call for a VADR as well. Along with all of this work, yes.
Jacob, before you leave that, I think it's important that we discuss the joint committee, just to be very clear when we're talking about that for those community members following along at home. This would be having representatives from the District Advisory Committee, the CBOC, which is the Community Bond Oversight Committee, having committee members from ESAC, MEAC. I mean, the list, we have many of them. I don't know the exact number. I think
there's 10.
There's 10. And so pulling representatives from those groups, and here's the thinking is, this is going to be difficult work, and having individuals who understand Austin ISD, our values, who are committed to AISD is going to be important. One of the things that could be a challenge for us is if we convened a whole new committee, the time that it would take to actually onboard individuals to really understand kind of, you know, what we're talking about and just the nuance of a system, budgeting process, all of these things. And so we recognize there'll be some adjustments. We're happy to hear any thoughts that you may have, but this is slightly different than process we've had in the past when they were like fully open-ended. I've experienced those. There's positives that can come from it, but generally speaking, we wanted folks who really were committed, understand Austin ISD, understand our values, and could take this work on with us, which is why we adopted this strategy. So thank you, Jacob, for allowing me to interrupt.
Of course. And I would also want to mention for this committee and for the public, right now we're envisioning that this committee would meet virtually, that we would use a webinar format so that it would still be available to the public to come listen while the committee goes through their work. We may have a last meeting in person because it's always good to get together and talk, but for the most part, the community can look towards being able to join these on Zoom to listen in. Along with this work at the same time, as Superintendent Segura mentioned, we want to work on this cost-saving audit with Gibson Consulting. I believe that the work that we have going on with Gibson will provide us some information that we can share back with the committee. Some of the things we hear from the committee are things we can then go ask Gibson for support on. And so there'll be that back and forth between both of these going on. But Gibson right now is really going to be focused on a phase 1 comprehensive data scan of this district. So really understanding the expenditures, the trends, the staffing of this district by looking at our data, looking at our org charts, and actually having conversations with different department leads to understand how all of that works together. They're also planning on creating a data dashboard that allows us to go and review all this information that they put forward and how they're looking at it. And then also having a meeting with staff and a meeting with the board as needed to brief through a report and provide an actual published report at some point that will have potential opportunities, including all their analysis and savings. From that, we could determine that a phase 2 may be necessary to where they're targeting some of those efforts. So perhaps they say that we believe that there's significant savings to be found in this program. And here's how we think that would happen, and here's what that means. We may then want to decide, this is not part of the current scope, it would be added on to that, to say, hey, work with us to break that down and actually come up with a plan on how we actualize it. Or it may be something that we as a district are just going to go forward with. But that's a conversation that we'd have with our board, have with our audit committee, and have with our partner Gibson. And so both of these will be going on at the same time. Again, hopefully to have that final report and kind of here's what we see as that 2-year plan right there around November. So that kind of summarizes very briefly this process. I'd like to open it or turn it back over to our superintendent.
Appreciate the presentation, Dr. Reach and Chief Ramos. I think the only thing that I would add is, for us, a lot is going to have to occur in a relatively short period of time, scale-wise. And I view this as a continuation of what we discussed as part of our last budgeting process. We knew that we would be here. We knew that we'd be taking on this work. We know that we want to start the work for the 25-26 fiscal year as early as November of 2024. And we want to ensure to our community that we have turned over every stone of opportunity, and we've done everything we can to limit impact to our students and to the classrooms, and certainly want to do that before we ask our community to vote on anything. And so I think, this is why we've adopted this plan and this strategy in this timeline with this type of committee. Just wanted to share that kind of perspective with you all.
Thank you. Trustees, other questions or comments?
I have a couple.
Yes, go ahead.
First, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the plan to stretch the budget work out in a public way and in a way that interacts with the board's work over a longer period of time, starting earlier. I greatly appreciate that. I think that's healthy. For us as an organization, I know a lot is happening within the administration on our campuses. That planning starts early, but really appreciate making that outward facing earlier. Thank you. And I would love to make sure that gets baked into our budget and calendar that we adopt as a board. And as we learn from this process, that maybe we consider some policy around it. If you're interested in bringing something to us, I love the idea of a 2-year budget of community voice, and that this isn't a response to crisis, but it's a really thinking deeply about best practice. So I just want to say thank you for that, and would love to think about how we might take what we learn and bake in some version of this. So thank you for that. To bring a different good policy brings stability to our district when we do that together. So thank you for that. Second thing is on the committee. I know we have recently, for some solid reasons, moved away from people being on multiple committees. And I understand, because we've had, kind of a narrow group of people sometimes doing a lot of that work in a broad community. And I understand why you're looking at that. So thank you for bringing that to us and forming something. I would just, Superintendent Segura, you said you were open to thoughts about that, and I just have a few to share for consideration. One is a representative from the Austin Council of PTAs. I think that has been a norm in our district for a long time, and I would personally love to see that. I think we have a whole crop of recent up-close graduates from the past couple of years who haven't yet found their way to our district committees. That is a cross, pretty diverse bunch who have already gotten that deep knowledge and shown a real interest in the district. And this might be a good way to bring some new voices in and perhaps, send them to some of our committees, because that's a channel I know we're working to develop, and I have such respect for that program. And then another possibility would be inviting volunteers from our campus advisory councils who see from a different perspective and are scattered at every campus in our district, if there's room for some of that. So just wanted to put those out there. Thank you.
And Trustee Boswell, I appreciate those comments, and we were kind of thinking along those lines for some adjustments, and so I think we're aligned in that way. I think for us, it's just kind of aligning, providing the resources for the entire group to be successful, and acknowledging that each person's coming from a different place. But no, I think we're aligned there.
Thank you.
Vice President Foster, I think I saw you pop up. Did you have any comments or questions? Okay.
Sure, sorry. It's taking me a minute to unmute. I guess just as I'm deeply appreciative of a really just thoughtful process, and for community input, and including the broadest range of consideration of community. So, teachers, staff, families, others, etc. As that unfolds, I guess part of what I said earlier to lift it back up and then put some nuance to it, I'd be very interested in some thought, concrete, explicit, not just thoughtfulness, but thoughtfulness that turns into sort of concrete values or priorities when we think about aspects of budgeting moving forward. So for instance, lifting up the idea of efficient leveraged excellence. The reality is that healthy school districts across the nation, 87 to 90% of costs are associated with paying human beings to, live into their excellence. So if we are going to get to a point where the deficit reduction gets where it needs to be for us to be fiscally healthy, at some point, there's going to be fewer people. And that's just how it is. But how do you get there, and what does that mean? So if you say no RIFs, which I'm interested in, then what? Well, as positions go unfilled, do you just force more work onto someone thoughtlessly because we just don't fill a position? Or do we thoughtfully restructure and leverage for excellence? When you think like that, you might come up with something like that as part of your way of thinking, and you might realize that part of what you need to do is paradoxically also pay people more, even as the force overall is smaller. So you have things like efficient leveraging of excellence. If there are reductions in services, how do you think about reductions in services? So somebody lifted up transportation. There are things about our approach to transportation that has us spend more than the state might expect, and that's because we're better than the state. Choosing to do certain things not only retains students in our district or brings new students to our district, but it also keeps our students safer. It does, has a number of benefits. But when we look at the choice to provide expanded transportation, is it possible to go in and notice that some of our expansions provide a convenience for families that could afford to not have the transportation, whereas some of the expanded transportation is absolutely necessary to, like I said, ensure the safety of a child? So when you look at reduction in services, maybe folks come up with their a value around leveraging them so that our most vulnerable children are absolutely protected in the process to the greatest extent possible. And that might mean that somebody who conveniently got transportation doesn't get transportation, which makes it harder on a family, but maybe they can accommodate that. One thing that some people like to talk about and some of us don't like to talk about, Trustee Hunter several weeks ago, a month or so ago, brought up the idea of closures and consolidations, putting guardrails around that super, super early. That any conversation that deals with any of that stuff has baked into it transparency, community conversation early and often, and thoughtful community conversation that reflects the values and interests of community. And perhaps maybe a value that emerges is that if any consolidation ever occurs, not only does there need to be clarity, to Trustee Kaufman's point, clarity that there will actually be savings up front, like that we know, when I say up front, I mean that we know there will be savings, but maybe a value that arises is that that local community should actually, and ironically, paradoxically, see benefit to the consolidation. So that as a, for instance, if you go to Norman Sims today, you see a community that in many respects is quite healthy, with many of the aspects of their health coming from the fact that the pillars on the building reflect the local community, and you see artwork that reflects folks, and you can talk to a custodian who's been with the district for 30 years, and you see that the consolidation happened in a way after a nightmare up front, eventually happened in a way that accrued to the benefit of the students. So maybe as vision and values are articulated, something is said about what happens, what has to not happen, and what must happen before you even begin a conversation about, consolidations, et cetera. So I would just like to, I guess, applaud the administration for laying out a timeline with a plan, but then also continually prod us to be concrete and explicit, community responsive, community driven, community resonant in coming up with our guidelines and guardrails for what any budget cuts would look like. With apology, not apology for not having a question there, but I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, Trustee Foster, I very much appreciate that comment, and I think one of the things that we learned through the long-range planning process was that we can build rubrics through a thoughtful process, and that's how we built up the 2022 bond program, right? And if you think about the equitable distribution of resources, that bond is a clear example of AISD being able to do it. And so take the same approach, but apply it in the opposite direction, which is to cuts, right? And I think that the strategy and the thought process to build those rubrics still holds. You have to think about limiting impact versus supporting and identifying opportunities by way of investment. Both can be true with a similar tool and process. So I think, Trustee Foster, we have, or I'd say this administration has experience doing something very thoughtful. I think this process affords the opportunity to do it as well. And I'm right there with you. I think that, to the point earlier, that each of those line items, bringing up buses again, there's 5 or 6 different items within that dollar amount, and each of those has different schools that are impacted. And so when you think about the students that those schools serve, how many of those are historically underserved student populations or student groups? What percentage of so you can go down that path, and you can actually come up with hopefully a strategy that aligns with our values, equitably as best we can, consider cuts because we know we're going to have to take them, and I think in that way we can accomplish what you're kind of speaking to Trustee Foster. And I am grateful that we've gone through the long-range planning process, and there will be long-range planning process members on this committee to ensure that, you know, we attack it in the same way.
Thank you.
Trustees, any other questions or comments? Vice President Foster, I really appreciated what you said, and I was hoping you would make that comment about the guardrails. And I would like for that actually to be added as a step in the timeline, because I feel like, and I guess this is a question to my colleagues here, is would it make sense for us to, or how important do y'all think it is to have some sorts of guidelines or guardrails created before our committees and the administration get really deep into this process? And then secondly, like, who should create those guardrails and guidelines? Is that something that the board should develop? Is that something that we do together with the administration? Is that something that the committee comes up with? Is it all of us? How do we do that? Thoughts?
I like that. I think it's all of us, right? Because we have a perspective, but that like specific group that Lynn was throwing those people's names in, they're gonna have another perspective, the administration, and it's just kind of like finding where they overlap. And something that you say a lot is first, do no harm. So there's changes that we have to make, and as Trustee Foster was saying, there's some things we do that some people can absorb, right? It's not such a big shock, and there's some, it would, like the reverberations would be years to come. We've seen that in our district, right? Something was done, like people still trying to recover from it in 2024. And so I think having, of course, the equity office, again, just kind of guiding like the thinking of the things that we're about to do. And I think if we approach it that way, then those sorts of consolidations or collapsing of things, it's a little bit easier. And I think it was Dr. Foster also that said, sometimes, like, Norman Sims is such a wonderful place, right? And at the beginning, I never thought that was gonna come out. I was like, this is a mess, and it's awful, and it's terrible. But it really, in the end, is a beautiful place that I'd love to hang out with and have a great leader and great staff. And I love going there. It's got a feeling to it. I like being there. And so there is, silver linings to some of the things that we may have to do. Of course, it never feels great when you're going through it. Then you look back, it's like, man, look, I really grew from that. And I think we as a district will be in that same position where we get through it and look back, right? It's never, like when you're going through it, it doesn't look so pretty, but on the other side, you're like, wow, that was really for the best. And if not for this particular circumstance, we would have never been brave enough to try that, right? So I think those guardrails are super important.
Thank you. Other thoughts on that?
I'll just say yes and all.
Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing nods from my colleagues. So, Superintendent, is that something that I know we don't have a lot of time here, but I think it does go with the philosophy of like going slow before you go fast. But I think, go slow to go fast. And because what my fear is, we're going to have people saying, no, you can't do this. Yes, do that. No, you can't, so like they speak from, I guess, I can't think of the right word, but anyway, they're asking for specifics before we actually know what the broader vision is for this. And I think if you have that vision, it serves as like a filter and provides context. And I don't know, I feel like it would help bring people along. If we can think about like things like, okay, if we go a consolidation route for campuses, it is done humanely and we don't split up. Like we put some guardrails around that. Like if we are going to make cuts to like class sizes, we're going to take into account, if we're going to increase class sizes, we're going to take into account other factors that, we're going to have an equity lens through that, and maybe not do it where we have the students with the greatest needs, or, just some tenets that we can strive to live by to help frame the work.
So, I guess my thought on this is, based on the two comments of all in all, the opportunity for that would have to occur after the committee's convened and after they go through the equity kind of, training session. Then I would want to consider how we would facilitate that conversation, because it'd be a lot of folks, and then our trustees as well. And so I'd want to maybe work with Jacob and Ally and the finance team to determine, what that would look like. I think there is significant benefit in doing it together, but I would want us to drive to consensus and also recognize that there may, there needs to be consideration even within those. And I just want to be clear, because when we talk about what my biggest fear is, there are many of them, but one that I'm concerned about is we go through this process, we identify the guardrails, we identify opportunities to reduce the budget, we bring them forward, and then the board doesn't support them. I mean, like, honestly, I think about the team of 10 and what we're trying to do as an organization long term. That to me would be a very difficult place to recover from, because the implementation part hasn't even begun, right? And so I think it's important that if we build the guardrails together and the committee guardrails together, and we move through it together, then we implement together. And so I think it sets us up well for that. So my answer is yes, but I'd want to work and figure out like what time like in this it'd have to be. I'm thinking probably second week in August, but I have to see timeline wise what that would look like. Because they're going to be virtual, and you all typically convene in this manner. I'd have to think through some of the logistics associated with it, but yes, I think we can do that. But again, I just to be, yes, we can do it. Yes, we will do it. And I think it'll help us, and if it gets us to a point where when we have recommendations and we got through this process, we are willing to implement them together. That would be, I think, very difficult to overcome as an organization. If we went through all this and then nothing was supported,
Yeah, I hear you.
that would be tough.
That would be tough.
Just for everybody.
No, it would be, and that was part of the idea behind going through that horrendous list of, potential, I'm gonna call them options, but you know what list I'm talking about that Jacob did earlier. It's like, yeah, we know it's not gonna be easy. The other question I have, and this is not something I've heard so much with this administration, but just in the past, we've all seen the district go through intense community engagement, and then there's an outcome, and everyone's like, okay, that was predetermined. They were going to do this all along. And so I guess my question is, if there are things that the administration is pretty sure that they want to do, I would encourage you to just say that up front. I would really say like, hey, we got to reduce planning periods. Sorry. Or we're going to undo the essential areas redesign, or we have to consolidate like at least 4 campuses. Like just, I'm speaking for myself, not on behalf of the board, but as someone who's been sitting up here for 5 years, I would rather just hear it up front and just know what you hope to see or what you think makes the most sense. Mostly because I trust your judgment on a lot of this. And sometimes it's like, okay, if I know that that's something that you believe in and you have looked at all the options and you can defend that, then that's really helpful to know. I don't know if all of my colleagues agree, but I would just say, like, for me, like, if there's stuff that you want to do, just put it out there.
Yeah, and so I guess my first comment on that is that know what I want to do, no. I think that when there's a recommendation and there is a strong recommendation, you will hear me say it, and I'll be very clear as to why I believe this is the way that we should move forward. The one caveat would be if something comes out of the Gibson audit that, to me, from an administrative perspective, from a management perspective, is something that we need to do, I'm going to be very clear about that pretty early in the process. And we've talked about that, right? That we're going to kind of look internally. We're going to look at things that are not so close to the classroom first. So I think if something comes out of that pretty early in the process, President Singh, I would make that clear, and I would tell you and tell the board and tell our community that I feel strongly that needs to be done, whatever that is at that time. That's helpful. But yeah, there is nothing baked. I mean, I don't know how we just went through a series of cuts for $30 million, and that was very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And very few, any of those were really known before we even considered them. We really had to go line by line to get there. So there's nothing predetermined at this point.
Got it. All right, anyone else? Okay. All right, well, this is some heavy stuff for a July meeting, but I appreciate the head start for us to think about it. So at this point, if there's no more questions or comments, thank you to our staff for presenting this. So we will now recess the open meeting at 10:28 p.m. and move to exec session pursuant to Texas Government Code sections 551.074, 551.072, 551.073, 551.087, 551.076, 551.0821, and 551.071. When we are finished with the executive session, we will briefly return to the open session to formally adjourn the meeting. Thank you so much.